There was once a young woman who lived with her mother and father on a farm just a few miles outside of a small town. Her parents were very, very protective of her as she was their only child. She was homeschooled and she helped out all the time on the farm. And once in a while, she would go into town with her father to get supplies. But other than that, she never left the land. And there seemed to be a sort of mystery around her. People talked. It was as if every time she went into town, she became more beautiful than the time before. And she grew up with the stories. And as she grew up, the stories grew as well. Young men started to watch her and keep an eye out for her when she was in town. They would start to talk, and many fell in love with her without ever even meeting her. Well, the father decided that it was time for her to find a husband. So he announced to the townspeople that he was looking for a husband for his daughter. And the young men in the town started coming around to court her. Well, they all went on one date, but something very strange happened. Every single one of them was seen running away and screaming, and no one would ever talk about what happened, and no one ever was interested in a second date. Well, they went through most of the young men in the town, and pretty soon they stopped coming around. Well, the parents were very dismayed. They weren't certain what was going on. People were talking. They thought perhaps something was wrong with the young girl. Maybe she didn't talk, or maybe she had a physical deformity that they couldn't find. Perhaps she wasn't very smart, or perhaps she had a sour personality. But the mother and father knew that none of that was true. She was very, very smart. She was very beautiful. She had a very sweet personality, and she did speak. She was quiet and demure, but she did speak very eloquently. They couldn't understand what was wrong and why these young men weren't interested in a second date. Well, then the father decided to spread the news around to some of the adjacent towns. So he sent the word out that he was looking for a husband for his daughter, and he built a house on the farm right next to theirs so that his daughter and her new husband could live there and raise their family on the same land. Well, suitors from the neighboring towns started coming around, and soon the exact same thing happened. The news spread that these young men were seen screaming and running from her, and none of them were interested in a second date, and none would ever talk about what happened. So the father couldn't figure out what was going on, and he just decided that maybe she just wasn't the marrying type. So he allowed her to move into that house. Well, one day, several months later, as they were working in the field, bringing in the animals for the night, a young man walked up the lane. He went right up to the father and said, I would like to meet your daughter. I would like to perhaps marry her. I've heard a lot about her, and I've heard that she's very beautiful. I'd like to take her on a date. Well, the father was very excited because no one had been around for quite some time. So he took him into the house to introduce him to his daughter. He introduced them, and she smiled demurely, and they walked outside and down the lane together. When they got out of sight to a place where her mother and father couldn't hear, she turned to him and said, Not now. Come back at midnight and be very, very quiet so that my parents can't hear you. Well, he was a little confused as to why she didn't want to go out right then and there, but he did as she asked, and he came back at midnight. He very quietly approached the house and knocked very softly on the window. She opened the window and climbed out. They got down the lane just about to the same place they had been earlier that day, and she said, Now, I need you to promise me something before we go anywhere. And he nodded his head enthusiastically because he was very interested in getting to know her better. And she said, I'm going to give you a love test. And if you pass, I will consider marrying you. And if you don't pass, you must promise me that you will never, ever tell anyone what happened here tonight. Well, he couldn't imagine what could happen that would distract him and make him not want to see her again. And he agreed to not tell anyone. In fact, he put his hand on his heart and he said, I solemnly swear I will never tell anyone what happened tonight. I will never breathe a word of this to anyone. Well, she was satisfied. So she said, All right, let's go. And he asked her, Where are we going? Well, she didn't answer. She just took off down the road, and he had to walk really fast to try to keep up with her. So they walked and walked quietly. They walked all the way through the town to the other side of town, to the edge of the woods. And she started down the path into the woods. Well, this was the kind of night that was sort of eerie. The moon was a sliver in the sky. There were almost no clouds out, and if they were, you couldn't see them because it was so foggy. The fog was so dense, he had a hard time seeing her in front of him. The trees loomed over the trail like giant monsters. It was chilly and eerie, and the wind was blowing. It was the kind of night you hear about in ghost stories where spirits roam. Well, he worked very hard to keep up with her as she was walking very, very fast, and soon he didn't hear her footsteps anymore, so he realized that she must have stopped. So he hurried to catch up with her, and he saw her silhouette with her nightgown and her hair billowing in the wind. And he realized that they were at the edge of a graveyard. She was about 30 feet in front of him, standing at the edge of a grave. So he went up to her, and it seemed to be a pretty fresh grave, even though all the rest of them were old gravestones covered with ivy and moss. She was standing next to one that looked fresh. As soon as he got there, she picked up an old rusty shovel and she started digging the grave, tossing the dirt all around. And then she fell to her knees and she started scraping the dirt away with her hands. She got to a coffin and she opened the coffin. She opened the white shroud that enveloped the body. She reached into the coffin and she pulled off an arm from the corpse. She put that arm in between her teeth and she took a big bite and she chewed very loudly as she looked at him the whole time. Then she said to him, "If you want to be with me, if you want to love me, you will do you will eat what I eat." Well, the young man didn't hesitate. When she tossed him the other arm, he picked it up, he grabbed it, and he took a bite. Well, it didn't taste the way he expected it would taste. So he took another bite. And then it dawned on him this was a prank. He looked at her and said, "Candy?" And she started laughing. Indeed, that corpse was made of candy and cake. It was a prank. And she said to him, "I have brought many, many young men here, and they all run away. But you have proven to me that you are brave, and I want to marry a brave man. So I will consider marrying you." And he said, "I don't think so. How could you do this?" And the rage filled his eyes and his face. And he said, "I thought you were just like me." And with that, he picked up the shovel and he dug another grave. He opened the coffin when he had unearthed it. He reached in and pulled out a limb from that body. He took a bite of it. And this time, it was the young girl who ran away.